The chest pain hit me like lightning at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. Not the dull ache you ignore, not the stress knot you massage away, but a crushing weight that made my left arm go numb and my vision blur. I was alone in my downtown Phoenix apartment, and for the first time in my 35 years, I genuinely thought I might die. The ambulance sirens wailed through empty streets as paramedics worked over me, and all I could think about was my family, how they'd react, how they'd drop everything and rush to be by my side, how wrong I was about to be. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I remember the exact moment my phone fell from my trembling fingers onto the sterile hospital bed. The text had been sent to our family group chat, Thompson Family, where we'd shared memes and birthday wishes for years. My message was simple and desperate. Heart attack at 35, need help. Banner University Medical Center, room 314. Please come. The delivered timestamp read 4:23 a.m. Within minutes, I watched the read receipts appear one by one. Dad, Jake, Ashley, Aunt Linda, Michael, they'd all seen it. All of them knew I was lying in a cardiac unit, wires attached to my chest, wondering if I'd see another sunrise. The first response came 27 minutes later. Not from my father, who'd raised me to believe family comes first. Not from Aunt Linda, who'd always called me her second daughter. It came from Jake, my younger brother, the one I'd helped through college, the one whose wedding I'd practically funded, the one I'd trusted with my deepest fears and biggest dreams. A single yellow emoji stared back at me from the screen. A laughing face with tears streaming down its cheeks. Below it, 3 letters that would change everything. LOL. My heart monitor beeped faster, and for a moment I thought I was having another episode. But it wasn't my damaged heart racing. It was rage, pure crystalline fury that cut through the morphine haze and made everything unnaturally clear. I stared at that emoji until my eyes burned. Jake thought my medical emergency was funny. My little brother, who I'd carried on my shoulders at county fairs, who I'd taught to ride a bike, who I'd stayed up all night helping with algebra homework, thought my brush with death was comedy material. Dr. Mitchell had been gentle when he explained what happened. A widowmaker, they called it. A type of heart attack that kills 90% of people my age before they reach the hospital. I was lucky, he said. Lucky to be alive, lucky that my neighbor Mrs. Chen heard me collapse and called 911, lucky that the paramedics got to me when they did. But lying there watching my family's cruel silence stretch into hours, lucky wasn't the word I'd use. Ashley finally typed something 6 hours later, when visiting hours had already started and I'd been alone with nurses and strangers all morning. Hope you're okay, Maya. Jake had to work today, and Tyler has soccer practice. Maybe this weekend? The casual tone made my stomach turn. Maybe this weekend. Like I was inviting them to a barbecue, not lying in intensive care after nearly dying. Like my life was a convenience they could schedule around. By noon, Dad had chimed in with his typical emotional distance. Glad you're alive, kiddo. These things happen. Remember when I had my back surgery? You get through it. No offer to visit, no questions about what I needed. Just a reminder that somehow, even my heart attack was about him. Aunt Linda hearted his message. Michael added a generic feel better soon, with a thumbs up emoji. The entire chat felt like strangers offering polite condolences to someone they'd never met. I turned my phone face down and closed my eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, memories flooded back with painful clarity. The graduation party I'd thrown for Jake when he finished business school, complete with a custom cake and all his friends. I'd spent my entire paycheck that month making it perfect. The family vacation to Sedona, I'd paid for when Dad's pension fell short. Ashley's baby shower, where I'd bought half the registry and stayed late to clean up. Michael's moving expenses when he relocated to Phoenix. Aunt Linda's car repairs when her transmission died. Years and years of showing up, paying up, stepping up. And here I was, facing the biggest crisis of my life, and they couldn't even be bothered to send a thoughtful text message. Jake's laughing emoji burned in my mind like a brand. Had he shown it to Ashley? Had they laughed together over coffee about dramatic Maya and her attention-seeking medical emergency? The thought made bile rise in my throat. Nicole arrived before any of them did. My best friend since college burst through the door at 3 p.m. with tears in her eyes and flowers in her hands. Maya, honey, I came as soon as I saw your Instagram story. I hadn't posted anything to Instagram. My phone had been silent except for the family chat. What Instagram story? I asked weakly. She showed me her screen.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Jake had posted a picture of his lunch with the caption Tuesday vibes. Some people are so dramatic about everything #family drama #attention. The timestamp showed 11:30 a.m., 7 hours after my message about the heart attack. Nicole's face went white as I explained what had happened. She scrolled through my phone, reading the family chat with growing horror. Maya, this is sick. Your own brother posted a laughing emoji when you had a heart attack. And your dad? Maya, what kind of people are these? I'd been asking myself the same question for hours. These were the people I'd restructured my entire life around. The people I'd moved to Phoenix to be closer to. The people I'd prioritized above friends, romantic relationships, career opportunities. I need to understand something, I told Nicole as she held my hand. Can you do me a favor? Don't tell them you're here. I want to see how long it takes for any of them to actually show up. She nodded grimly. We waited and waited. Visiting hours ended at 8 p.m. Not one member of my family had walked through that door. Not one had called the hospital directly. Not one had sent flowers, or a card, or even asked which room I was in. That night, alone in the cardiac wing, with machines monitoring my every heartbeat, I made a decision that would reshape everything. I opened my notes app and started typing. Not an angry message to send to the family chat, not a confrontational text to Jake. Just a simple list. Every birthday I'd remembered when they forgot each other's. Every financial emergency I'd solved without being asked. Every holiday I'd hosted, every bill I'd paid, every favor I'd done, every time I'd put their needs before my own health, happiness, or future. The list was 13 pages long. 13 pages of receipts, both literal and metaphorical, documenting years of one-sided love. As I scrolled through my bank statements and old text messages, a pattern emerged that I'd been too close to see. I wasn't their daughter, sister, niece, or cousin. I was their safety net, their backup plan, their reliable source of money, labor, and emotional support. And the moment I needed them to be those things for me, they disappeared. Dr. Mitchell came by for evening rounds and found me crying quietly. Not from physical pain, but from a different kind of heartbreak. Maya, the surgery went perfectly. Your recovery is ahead of schedule. You should be celebrating. I wiped my eyes and managed a weak smile. Doctor, can I ask you something? In your experience, when someone has a heart attack this young, does their family usually? I gestured toward my empty room. He sat down heavily in the visitor's chair. Maya, I've been doing this for 22 years. I've seen families camp out in waiting rooms for weeks. I've seen people fly across the country for less serious conditions. I've also seen patients whose families treat them like an inconvenience. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Sometimes the people who love us the most aren't the people we share DNA with. Sometimes family is something you choose, not something you're born into. His words hit deeper than any medication. I thought about Nicole, who dropped everything to be here. About my coworker David, who'd texted hourly asking for updates. About Emma from my yoga class, who'd sent a meditation playlist and offered to bring groceries when I got home. These people, who owed me nothing, had shown more care in one day than my blood relatives had managed in 35 years. Wednesday morning brought a new message in the family chat. Jake had tagged everyone. "Hey guys, Ashley's mom is having hip surgery next week. We're all going to take turns helping out. Maya, can you take Thursday and Friday? You're so good at the caretaking stuff." The audacity was breathtaking. Less than 48 hours after laughing at my heart attack, he was asking me to provide elder care for his mother-in-law. The message had 4 heart reactions. 4 people who thought this was a reasonable request. I stared at my phone for a long time before typing my response. It was short and simple. "I'm still in the hospital recovering from my heart attack. The one you all ignored." The chat went silent immediately. No responses, no reactions, no acknowledgements, just digital silence that spoke louder than any argument could have. They were embarrassed, maybe even ashamed, but not enough to actually apologize or show up. Thursday morning, Dr. Mitchell cleared me for discharge. "You'll need to take it easy for at least 6 weeks. No heavy lifting, no stressful situations, and you'll need someone to check on you regularly for the first week." I nodded and signed the paperwork, already knowing that someone wouldn't be coming from my family. Nicole had offered, but she lived an hour away and had her own job and responsibilities. I was going to be recovering from a major cardiac event essentially alone. The Uber ride home was quiet. Phoenix's desert landscape blurred past the window as I tried to process what the last 3 days had taught me. My family hadn't just failed to support me during a medical crisis. They'd actively mocked it. Jake's laughing emoji wasn't a moment of poor judgment or dark humor. It was a window into how little my life actually meant to them. How replaceable I was to people I'd considered irreplaceable. My apartment felt different when I walked in. The same furniture, same photos on the walls, same desert view from my balcony. But something fundamental had shifted. This space, which had always felt temporary and small, suddenly felt like sanctuary. It was mine. Quiet, peaceful, and free from people who would laugh at my pain or treat my emergencies like inconveniences. I spent that afternoon going through my phone, really looking at years of conversations with fresh eyes. The pattern was everywhere once I started looking for it. Every text from Dad asking for money disguised as catching up. Every message from Jake asking for favors disguised as family bonding. Every group chat about family events where I was expected to contribute financially but never consulted about planning. Every birthday where they remembered to ask what I was bringing but forgot to ask how I was doing. The realization was devastating and liberating at the same time. I'd spent my entire adult life performing worthiness for people who would never value me the way I valued them. I'd convinced myself that being needed was the same as being loved, that being useful was the same as being family. But lying in that hospital bed, with machines keeping my heart beating while my family shared memes and other chats, I'd learned the difference. Friday evening, my phone rang. Dad's name appeared on the screen. My first instinct was relief. Finally, someone was calling to check on me properly. But his voice, when I answered, carried the tone I'd heard thousands of times before. The one that meant he needed something. "Maya, kiddo, how are you feeling? Listen, I hate to ask, but my mortgage payment is due Monday and my direct deposit got delayed. Could you spot me until Wednesday? It's just $800. The request hung in the air between us like poison. $800. He was asking his daughter, who'd nearly died 3 days ago and was still recovering from emergency heart surgery, to loan him $800. He hadn't asked about my prognosis, my medications, my recovery plan, or whether I needed anything. Just money. Always money, Dad, I said slowly. I just had a heart attack. I'm on medical leave from work. I'm going to have significant medical bills, and I can't do any physical activity for weeks." There was a pause. Then he sighed, the way he always did when I wasn't immediately compliant. "Right, of course, I just thought. Well, you usually help out when I'm in a bind, but I understand if you can't right now." The manipulation was so familiar, I almost fell for it. The guilt, the subtle accusation that I was being selfish, the implication that helping him should be my default state regardless of my circumstances. But this time, instead of scrambling to find a way to send money I couldn't afford, I felt something different. Clarity. Cold, sharp clarity that cut through decades of conditioning. "Dad, I've been helping with your financial binds for 15 years. I've never asked you for anything in return. 3 days ago, I nearly died, and you didn't even call the hospital to see if I was okay. You didn't visit, you didn't send flowers, you didn't ask what I needed, but now you're asking me for money." My voice was steady, calm, and completely detached. It was the voice of someone who had finally woken up. Another pause, longer this time. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted to the defensive one I remembered from childhood. "Maya, that's not fair. You know I'm not good with medical stuff. It makes me uncomfortable. And I figured, if it was really serious, someone would have called me directly. Someone. As if he wasn't my father, as if his daughter's medical emergency was someone else's responsibility to communicate." I hung up the phone without saying goodbye. For the first time in my life, I hung up on my father, and instead of feeling guilty or anxious like I normally would, I felt free. Like a weight I'd been carrying for decades had finally been lifted off my shoulders. The phone rang again, immediately. Dad calling back. I declined the call. It rang again. Declined again. After the fourth attempt, I turned my phone off entirely. That weekend, I did something I'd never done before. I rested without guilt. I ordered food delivery instead of cooking. I watched movies in bed instead of cleaning my apartment. I ignored the growing list of unread messages and missed calls from family members who'd suddenly remembered I existed now that I wasn't responding to their demands. For the first time since my mother had died, when I was 19, I prioritized my own healing over everyone else's convenience. Sunday night, I turned my phone back on to find 23 missed calls and 47 text messages. The family chat had exploded with activity. Jake demanding to know why I wasn't answering Dad, Ashley asking if I was being dramatic again. Aunt Linda suggesting I was having some kind of breakdown. Michael offering to talk sense into me if needed, not one message asking about my health or recovery. Not one apology for the laughing emoji or the days of silence while I was hospitalized. The final message in the thread was from Dad, sent an hour earlier. "Maya, your behavior this week has been completely unacceptable. I raised you better than this. Family comes first, and family helps each other out. If you can't understand that basic principle, then maybe you need to reconsider your priorities." I read the message 3 times, letting the full irony sink in. Family comes first, from the man who couldn't be bothered to visit his daughter in the cardiac unit. Family helps each other out. From the people who'd laughed at my medical emergency and then asked me to provide elder care services while I was still recovering. Maybe I did need to reconsider my priorities. Maybe I needed to reconsider what family actually meant. That night, I opened my laptop and created a new document. At the top, I typed, "The last 15 years, a financial and emotional audit." Then I began documenting everything. Every loan that became a gift, every emergency I'd solved, every holiday I'd funded, every favor I'd provided, every birthday, graduation, wedding, baby shower, housewarming, and celebration I'd contributed to, without being asked. The numbers were staggering. Over the past 15 years, I'd given my family more than $67,000 in direct financial support. Money for rent, car payments, medical bills, home repairs, vacations, gifts for their children, deposits for apartments, business startup costs. Money I'd never seen again, never asked for back, never even mentioned in passing. Money that could have been my house down payment, my emergency fund, my retirement savings. But the emotional cost was even higher. Decades of putting their needs first had left me without a serious romantic relationship, without close friendships, without hobbies or interests that weren't somehow connected to solving their problems. I'd become so focused on being the person they needed that I'd forgotten to become the person I wanted to be. As I typed, my chest started to ache. Not the sharp, terrifying pain of a heart attack, but something deeper and more persistent. The ache of a life, half-lived. The pain of love, given to people who couldn't return it. The grief of finally understanding that I'd been performing in a play, where I was the only one who didn't know my role was unpaid understudy. But somewhere in that pain, something else was growing. Something I hadn't felt in years: anger. Not the explosive, destructive kind, but the cold, focused kind that burns away illusions and leaves only truth. I was angry at them for using me, but I was angrier at myself for allowing it. For accepting crumbs and calling them feast, for mistaking being needed for being loved. Monday morning, I made an appointment with Dr. Patricia Williams, a therapist Nicole had recommended. It was time to understand how I'd ended up here, how a woman with a graduate degree, a successful career, and a good heart had somehow become an ATM for people who wouldn't cross the street to help her. It was time to figure out who I was when I wasn't busy being who everyone else needed me to be. But first, I was going to do something I should have done years ago. I was going to set boundaries, real ones. The kind with consequences, the kind that meant something, because my heart had been broken once by disease, and I'd survived. I wasn't going to let it be broken again by the people who were supposed to protect it. The disbelief lasted exactly 47 minutes. That's how long it took for me to cycle through denial, bargaining, and false hope before landing squarely in the territory of devastating clarity. I kept refreshing the family chat, certain there had been some kind of technical glitch. Maybe Jake's phone had auto-corrected something innocent into that laughing emoji. Maybe Dad's silence was because he was frantically driving to the hospital and couldn't text safely. Maybe Ashley was coordinating some kind of surprise visit with flowers and homemade soup. But as the minutes ticked by on the cardiac monitor, reality settled into my bones like cold cement. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a technological error. This was exactly what it appeared to be: my family's true feelings about my worth, displayed in real time during the most vulnerable moment of my life. The morphine drip couldn't numb the psychic pain of that realization, nothing could. I found myself obsessively checking the red timestamps, watching as each family member logged into the chat throughout the morning without responding. Jake had been active on other social media platforms, liking posts about basketball games and sharing memes about coffee addiction. Ashley had posted Instagram stories about Tyler's soccer practice preparation. Dad had commented on 3 different Facebook articles about politics. They weren't unavailable, they weren't in crisis mode, dropping everything to support their family member in medical distress. They were going about their Tuesday routines, while I lay attached to machines that were keeping track of whether my heart would keep beating. The nurse who came to check my vitals at noon noticed my distress. Sandra was a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and steady hands, who'd probably seen every variation of family dysfunction play out in hospital rooms. "Honey, your blood pressure is elevated. Are you in pain?" she asked, adjusting the IV drip. I wanted to tell her that my chest felt fine, that the surgical site was healing perfectly, but that something inside my ribcage felt shattered in a way that had nothing to do with cardiac tissue damage. Instead, I just nodded and let her increase the anxiety medication. It was easier than explaining that my family had responded to my near-death experience with amusement and indifference. Easier than admitting that I was beginning to suspect this wasn't an aberration but a pattern I'd been too invested to see clearly. The medication made everything fuzzy around the edges, but it couldn't blur the sharp focus that was developing around one central truth. I had spent decades loving people who were incapable of loving me back. By Wednesday morning, exactly 36 hours after my initial text about the heart attack, Aunt Linda had finally responded. Her message was brief and felt like it had been composed by a customer service representative. Just saw this, Maya. Hope you're feeling better. Let me know if you need anything. The casual tone was jarring. Just saw this. As if my message about nearly dying had been buried under promotional emails and spam. As if cardiac emergencies were the kind of thing you get around to eventually, like responding to party invitations or book club discussions. I typed and deleted 17 different responses before settling on "I'm still in the hospital, it was serious." The delivered timestamp appeared immediately, followed by the red receipt, then nothing. Aunt Linda, who had called me her bonus daughter at family gatherings, who had told everyone that I was more responsible than her own kids, couldn't manage a follow-up question about my condition or prognosis. The silence stretched for hours, until she finally sent a thumbs-up emoji. A thumbs up, as if I'd reported successfully changing my oil or completing a grocery run. Michael's eventual response was even worse in its studied casualness. Wow, crazy timing, I'm actually dealing with my own health scare too, been having these headaches that won't go away. Probably stress from the new job, we should compare notes when you're out. He had managed to turn my heart attack into a conversation starter about his tension headaches. The self-absorption was so complete, it was almost impressive. Almost. Jake's second contribution to the chat came Wednesday evening. Dad, reminder that you're babysitting Tyler this weekend, while Ashley and I go to Sedona. Maya, can you pick up groceries for Dad before then? You know how he forgets to eat when he's watching Tyler. The message was so stunningly tone-deaf that I read it 4 times to make sure I wasn't hallucinating from medication. My brother, who had laughed at my medical emergency, was now assigning me childcare support duties while I was still recovering in intensive care. The casual assumption that I would, of course, handle the grocery shopping was the detail that broke something fundamental inside me. Not just the request itself, but the complete absence of any awareness that asking a heart attack patient to run errands might be inappropriate. It revealed how thoroughly they had categorized me as a service provider rather than a person with my own health concerns and limitations. I was a function in their lives, not a human being deserving of consideration or care. That night, I did something I'd never done before. I screenshotted every message in the family chat and sent them to Nicole with a simple caption, "Am I losing my mind? Or is this insane?" Her response came within minutes. Maya, this is beyond insane. This is abusive. Your brother laughed at your heart attack and then asked you to run errands. These people are sick. Seeing someone else's shock and outrage validated what I was feeling. I wasn't being dramatic or oversensitive. My family's behavior was objectively cruel. Nicole's validation gave me permission to feel the rage that had been building since Tuesday morning. White-hot, purifying anger that burned away years of excuse-making and benefit of the doubt-giving. I was furious at Jake for that laughing emoji, but I was equally furious at myself for being surprised by it. The signs had been there for years. I'd just been too invested in maintaining the fiction of a loving family to acknowledge them. Thursday brought the revelation that would crystallize my decision to act. While scrolling through my phone during a particularly boring afternoon of cardiac monitoring, I discovered that Jake had created a new group chat called Weekend Plans that included Dad, Ashley, Michael, and Aunt Linda. Everyone except me. They were coordinating the Sedona trip, discussing restaurant reservations and hiking plans, sharing excitement about a mini family reunion. The timestamp showed the chat had been created Tuesday evening, hours after my heart attack message. The timeline was devastating in its clarity. They had seen my medical emergency, ignored it completely, and then immediately moved on to planning recreational activities that deliberately excluded me. The message thread was full of laughter emojis and heart reactions, the same emoji energy that Jake couldn't spare for my cardiac crisis, but had plenty of for coordinating family fun. The casual cruelty was breathtaking. But it was Ashley's comment that finally pushed me past the point of no return. So nice to have a drama-free family weekend. Some people always have some crisis going on, you know? 3 people had hearted that message. 3 people had enthusiastically agreed that my heart attack was drama and that my absence would make their trip more enjoyable. The people who had claimed to love me were celebrating my exclusion from family activities while I recovered from nearly dying. I spent Thursday night staring at the ceiling, finally accepting what I'd been avoiding for years. These people didn't love me. They tolerated me as long as I was useful and resented me whenever I needed anything in return. My heart attack hadn't revealed a temporary failure of compassion, it had revealed their fundamental incapacity for empathy where I was concerned. The medical crisis had simply made visible what had always been true: I was not family to them. I was staff. Friday morning, Dr. Mitchell delivered news that should have been cause for celebration. My heart was healing ahead of schedule, and I could go home that afternoon with a good prognosis for full recovery. But instead of relief, I felt something closer to dread. Home meant returning to a life structured entirely around people who had proven they couldn't care less whether I lived or died. Home meant resuming my role as the family ATM and problem solver while pretending Tuesday's emoji had never happened. But as Dr. Mitchell explained my discharge instructions and medication schedule, a different kind of clarity began forming. I didn't have to go back to that life. I didn't have to pretend Tuesday hadn't happened. I didn't have to resume my position as the family's unpaid support staff. For the first time in my adult life, I had a legitimate reason to step back from all of it, and more importantly, I finally had the emotional clarity to see why stepping back was necessary. The decision formed slowly, like dawn breaking over the desert. I was going to use my recovery period to recover from more than just heart surgery. I was going to recover from the exhausting performance of loving people who couldn't love me back. I was going to use these doctor-mandated weeks of rest to figure out who Maya Thompson was when she wasn't busy being everyone else's solution to everything. As the discharge nurse went through my paperwork, I made a mental list of immediate changes: no more automatic yes to every request, no more financial bailouts without clear repayment terms, no more accepting exclusion from family events while still being expected to provide support services. No more performing gratitude for the privilege of being used. The heart attack had nearly killed me, but it was also going to save my life in ways that had nothing to do with cardiac surgery. The Uber ride home felt different than the previous Friday's journey from the hospital. That trip had been about physical recovery and emotional devastation. This one was about something harder to name: metamorphosis. I was returning to the same apartment, but I wasn't the same person who had left it in an ambulance 5 days earlier. That Maya had been desperate for family approval and willing to sacrifice anything to maintain relationships that only existed on her side. This Maya understood that love without reciprocity isn't love at all, it's exploitation dressed up in holiday cards and birthday wishes. My apartment looked exactly the same, but everything felt different. The photos of family gatherings on my walls now looked like evidence of my own self-deception. The emergency contact list stuck to my refrigerator seemed like a cruel joke, given that my actual emergency had proven those contacts to be worthless. Even my furniture arrangement, optimized for hosting family visits that always resulted in me cooking, cleaning, and paying for everything, now struck me as a monument to my own willingness to be used. But there was something else in the space too, something I hadn't noticed before because I'd been too busy orchestrating everyone else's happiness to pay attention to my own environment. Quiet. Deep restorative quiet that wasn't interrupted by family drama, phone calls, or requests for emergency financial assistance. Sunlight streaming through windows that I'd actually had time to enjoy because I wasn't running errands for people who couldn't be bothered to visit me in intensive care. I spent my first afternoon home doing something revolutionary, nothing productive. I didn't meal prep for the week ahead or organize my medicine cabinet or create a recovery schedule designed to get me back to peak family supporting capacity as quickly as possible. I sat on my couch with a cup of tea and watched the shadows move across my living room floor as the sun set over Phoenix. It was the most peaceful I'd felt in years. That evening my phone buzzed with a message from Dad. Maya, hope you're settling in okay. Quick question, can you Venmo me that $800 for the mortgage? My deposit still hasn't come through and I'm getting worried about late fees. The audacity was stunning. 5 days after laughing at my heart attack and 2 days after asking me to run errands while recovering from cardiac surgery, he was back to treating me like a personal loan service. No genuine concern about my health, no acknowledgement of his behavior during my hospitalization, just another financial request. For the first time in 15 years, I didn't immediately start calculating whether I could afford to help him. I didn't start brainstorming ways to restructure my budget to accommodate his crisis. I didn't feel the familiar surge of anxiety about disappointing him or letting the family down. Instead, I felt something close to relief. Here was the proof I needed that nothing had changed on their end. Dad's crisis was still more important than my recovery. His comfort was still more valuable than my emotional well-being. His immediate needs still trumped any consideration of what I might be going through. I typed my response carefully, editing it multiple times before sending. Dad, I'm recovering from a major cardiac event, and I'm on unpaid medical leave. I won't be able to help with money for the foreseeable future. You might want to contact the bank about payment deferment options. It was factual, polite, and completely honest. It was also the first time I'd ever said no to one of his financial requests without immediately offering an alternative solution or timeline for when I might be able to help instead. The response came within minutes. Maya, I understand you're dealing with health stuff, but this is my house we're talking about. I could lose everything. Surely you can spare $800. You always figure something out. Always figure something out. As if my previous financial assistance had been effortless magic rather than careful budgeting, sacrifice, and stress. As if my ability to help had been unlimited rather than the result of denying myself things I wanted and needed. But it was the phrase health stuff that really crystallized my decision. Health stuff, not major cardiac surgery or near-death experience or even serious medical condition. Health stuff. As if my heart attack was equivalent to a minor cold or routine dental cleaning. The dismissiveness was so complete that it bordered on pathological. My father literally could not acknowledge the severity of what had happened to me because doing so would require him to feel guilty about his complete absence during my medical crisis. I turned my phone off without responding and spent the evening in the kind of silence I'd been craving for years. No family crisis calls, no urgent financial requests, no coordination of other people's social calendars or emotional emergencies. Just me, my healing heart, and the revolutionary concept that my own well-being could be my top priority. The quiet felt like meditation, like prayer, like coming home to myself after decades of living in exile. That night, I did something I'd never done before. I wrote in a journal. Not a gratitude journal or a recovery journal or any kind of self-improvement project. Just stream of consciousness thoughts about what I'd learned in the past week. The writing felt like surgery, cutting away layers of pretense and people-pleasing to get to something real underneath. Something that had been buried under years of performing the role of the perfect daughter, sister, and niece. What I found under all that performance was rage. Clean, justified rage at people who had taken advantage of my good heart for so long that they'd forgotten I had needs of my own. Rage at myself for allowing it to continue for so long. And underneath the rage, something even more powerful: relief. Relief at finally having permission to stop pretending that one-sided relationships were normal. Relief at finally understanding that love didn't require me to set myself on fire to keep other people warm. By Saturday morning, I had made a decision that would have terrified the old Maya but felt like freedom to the new one. I was going to use my cardiac recovery period to engineer a different kind of recovery entirely. I was going to recover my self-respect, my boundaries, and my right to be treated with basic human decency. The heart attack had almost killed me, but it was also going to teach me how to live. The revelation phone call came at 2:14 p.m. on a Sunday afternoon, exactly 9 days after my heart attack. I'd been napping on my couch, still following doctor's orders for plenty of rest, when Ashley's voice cut through my apartment like a blade. She wasn't calling me directly, she was on the phone with someone else, and I could hear every word through the thin walls of our adjoining balconies. Our apartments shared an outdoor space, and Ashley had never been one to consider that sound travels. Honestly, Maya's being so selfish about this whole thing, Ashley was saying, her voice carrying that particular tone of exasperation I'd heard her use when discussing Tyler's homework resistance. Like, we get it, you had chest pains or whatever, but some of us have real problems. Jake's been stressed out of his mind trying to cover her usual contributions, and now she's acting like she's too good to help the family. Chest pains or whatever. My widowmaker heart attack, the kind that kills most people before they reach medical care, had been reduced to chest pains or whatever in Ashley's narrative. I stayed perfectly still on my couch, afraid that any movement might alert her to my presence and end this inadvertent revelation about how my family really discussed me when they thought I couldn't hear. I mean, we've all been to the emergency room before, Ashley continued, and I could hear the eye roll in her voice. Remember when Tyler broke his arm? I didn't make it everyone else's problem. I handled it like an adult, but Maya has always been dramatic about everything. Remember her college graduation? She acted like it was such a big deal that she couldn't go because of money, but honestly she probably just wanted attention. The college graduation comment hit like a physical blow. Ashley was talking about the day I'd found out I couldn't afford the ceremony fee and cap and gown rental because I'd spent my graduation money on Dad's car repairs. I'd cried in private and told everyone I was too busy with work to attend the ceremony. Ashley had known the real reason. I'd confided in her during one of those late-night conversations when I'd still believed we had a sister-like relationship. She'd comforted me that night, telling me that the ceremony wasn't important, and that she was proud of me for putting family first. Now she was rewriting history, turning my sacrifice into attention-seeking behavior and my financial struggles into personal failings. The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking, but what hurt more was the realization that this was probably how they'd always talked about me. Every financial contribution I'd made, every emergency I'd solved, every time I'd put their needs ahead of my own, it had all been reframed as manipulation or obligation rather than love. Plus, Ashley's voice grew more animated, as if she was warming to her subject. Maya acts like she's the only one who ever helps out, but hello. Jake drives Dad to his appointments sometimes, and I watch Tyler when she's working late. It's not like she's the only one making sacrifices. She just keeps track of everything like some kind of accountant. It's honestly weird how she remembers every little thing she's ever done for anyone. The gaslighting was so comprehensive it was almost artistic. Jake driving Dad to appointments sometimes, versus my 15 years of consistent financial support. Ashley's occasional babysitting versus my funding of Tyler's school supplies, sports equipment and birthday parties. My keeping track of financial contributions that had totaled in the tens of thousands of dollars being framed as petty scorekeeping rather than reasonable awareness of my own generosity. But it was the next part of the conversation that shattered something fundamental inside me. And honestly, Ashley's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper that somehow carried even more clearly. I think Maya likes being needed. Like she gets off on being the family savior or whatever. It makes her feel important. But now that she's getting older and her looks are going and she doesn't have a boyfriend or husband, I think she's realizing that being useful is the only way people want her around. The words hit my chest with more force than the heart attack had. My looks are going. The only way people want her around. Ashley, who I'd helped through her postpartum depression, who I'd given money for Ashley's first Mother's Day spa treatment, who I'd supported through every marriage crisis with Jake, was discussing my worth as a human being like I was a piece of furniture that had outlived its usefulness. Jake thinks we should just let her have her little tantrum and she'll come around, Ashley continued, like she always does. Remember when she got mad about us not inviting her to Michael's engagement party? She sulked for like a week and then showed up with an expensive gift anyway. She can't stay away because she doesn't have anywhere else to go. We're literally all she has. Michael's engagement party. The event I'd found out about through social media, where I'd seen photos of my entire family celebrating while I sat alone in my apartment wondering why I hadn't been included. The expensive gift Ashley was referencing was the crystal wine glasses I'd bought after seeing the party photos, because I'd convinced myself that maybe they'd simply forgotten to invite me, and I should respond with grace rather than hurt feelings. They hadn't forgotten to invite me. They'd deliberately excluded me and then waited to see if I'd still provide expensive gifts afterward. It had been a test of my willingness to accept mistreatment, and I'd failed by rewarding their cruelty with generosity. The pattern was now so clear it was almost architectural in its precision: exclude Maya, wait for Maya to apologize for being excluded, accept Maya's apology gifts, repeat cycle. The funniest part, Ashley was saying, and I could hear genuine amusement in her voice, is that she thinks this heart attack thing makes her special or something. Like we're all supposed to drop everything because Maya has a medical issue. But honestly, my grandmother had 3 heart attacks and never made it everyone else's problem. Maya's just not tough enough to handle real life without making it dramatic. 3 heart attacks versus 1. Maya's not tough enough. My near-death experience was being measured against Ashley's grandmother's cardiac history and found wanting. The comparison was so absurd it would have been funny if it wasn't so revealing about how completely Ashley had disconnected from any sense of empathy or proportion. My medical emergency wasn't valid because someone else had experienced more medical emergencies with less family support, but it was what Ashley said next that ended any possibility of reconciliation forever. Plus, and this is terrible to say, but Jake and I were talking and we kind of think Maya did this to herself. Like she's always been high stress and dramatic, and she eats terribly and never exercises. So it's not like this came out of nowhere. She's probably been building up to some kind of health crisis for years with her lifestyle choices. Did this to herself. My genetic predisposition to cardiac issues, my family history of heart disease, my clean blood work and normal weight and regular yoga practice, none of that mattered in Ashley's narrative. My heart attack was a character flaw, a predictable consequence of being Maya, a self-inflicted problem that I'd brought on myself through the crime of being dramatic and high stress. The victim blaming was so complete that it took my breath away. And honestly, Ashley's voice was reaching its crescendo. I think this whole thing might be a blessing in disguise. Like maybe Maya will finally learn that she can't control everyone's lives by throwing money at problems. Maybe she'll get some perspective about what real family means instead of thinking that being useful is the same as being loved. Being useful is the same as being loved. The phrase hung in the air like poison gas. Ashley had just articulated, with brutal clarity, exactly what my role in this family had always been. I'd thought I was the beloved daughter, sister, and niece who happened to be financially generous. But I was actually the hired help who'd been deluded into thinking her employment was a family relationship, the useful one. The one whose value was entirely conditional on her ability to solve problems and provide resources. The conversation was winding down, with Ashley making plans to meet whoever she was talking to for coffee and continuing to complain about having to manage Jake's stress about my reduced availability for family service. I sat frozen on my couch long after her voice faded, staring at the ceiling and trying to process what I'd just learned about how my family viewed me when they thought I couldn't hear. It wasn't just that they didn't love me. It was that they actively resented me for expecting love in return for everything I'd given them. My desire for genuine family connection wasn't just unrealistic, it was annoying. My hurt feelings about being excluded weren't valid emotional responses, they were manipulative tantrums. My heart attack wasn't a medical crisis deserving of support, it was an inconvenient disruption of their normal access to my resources. But perhaps most devastatingly, they saw my continued participation in family dynamics as inevitable. They were counting on my emotional dependency, my lack of other relationships, my desperate need to belong somewhere. Ashley's confidence that I would come around because I didn't have anywhere else to go, revealed how completely they'd misunderstood both my motivation for helping them and my capacity to survive without them. The irony was that Ashley was right about one thing: I had been confusing being useful with being loved, but she was wrong about who had created that confusion. I hadn't imposed that dynamic on them. They'd trained me into it year after year, by only showing appreciation when I was solving their problems and only including me when they needed something. They'd taught me that my value was conditional, and then they'd resented me for believing what they'd taught me. That evening, I did something I'd never done before. I called in sick to a family obligation without actually being sick. Dad had left me 3 voicemails about needing help setting up his new cable box before his Sunday night shows, and for the first time in my adult life, I simply didn't call him back. I didn't fabricate an excuse or apologize for being unavailable. I just let his need go unmet and discovered that the world didn't end when I prioritized my emotional well-being over his convenience. The relief was extraordinary. Instead of spending my Sunday evening crawling around behind Dad's entertainment center, trying to decipher cable installation instructions while he criticized my technical abilities, I took a bath with Epsom salts and read a book I'd been meaning to finish for 2 years. Instead of listening to his complaints about technology and his various other grievances against modern life, I listened to jazz music and watched the sunset through my bathroom window. It was the first evening in years that I'd spent doing exactly what I wanted to do without considering anyone else's needs or expectations. The silence of my phone, no grateful texts from Dad, no family chat messages about my helpfulness, felt like freedom rather than rejection. I was beginning to understand the difference between being alone and being lonely, and I was discovering that being alone with people who respected me was infinitely preferable to being surrounded by people who used me. Monday morning brought a text from Jake that confirmed everything Ashley had revealed in her balcony conversation. "Maya, Dad's pretty upset that you didn't help him yesterday. I know you're going through something, but family commitments don't just disappear because you're having health issues. We need to talk about your attitude lately. Your attitude, not your recovery, not your legitimate health concerns, not your reasonable expectation of family support during a medical crisis. Your attitude." The text was a masterpiece of manipulation, containing every gaslighting technique I'd been subjected to for years in one neat paragraph. My medical leave was going through something, as if cardiac surgery was a phase rather than a major health event. My family's inability to provide support was reframed as my failure to meet commitments. My newfound boundaries were evidence of a bad attitude rather than healthy self-preservation. But what struck me most was the complete absence of any curiosity about my perspective. Jake wasn't asking how I was feeling, or whether I needed anything or why I might be less available than usual. He was demanding compliance with family expectations while simultaneously denying that those expectations might be unreasonable given my circumstances. The conversation was already over in his mind, he just needed me to accept my role and resume normal service. For the first time in my relationship with Jake, I responded with complete honesty. I'm recovering from a major cardiac event that you responded to with a laughing emoji. I'm not available for non-emergency family tasks while I'm following doctor's orders for rest and stress reduction. If Dad needs technical support, he can call the cable company's customer service line. I included no justifications, no apologies, and no alternative solutions. Just a clear statement of my current reality and limitations. The response came within minutes. Maya, that emoji was a mistake. I was texting Ashley at the same time and sent it to the wrong chat. You're being really unfair right now. A mistake. The laughing emoji that had crystallized my understanding of my family's true feelings was now being explained away as a technological error. The gaslighting was so brazen that it was almost impressive in its scope, but I'd heard Ashley's balcony conversation. I knew that Jake's stress about my reduced availability was a frequent topic of discussion, that they viewed my heart attack as attention-seeking behavior, that they were confident I would eventually come around because I had no other options. Jake's claim that the emoji was accidental was just another layer of the deception they'd built around their treatment of me. I didn't respond to his text. Instead, I blocked his number and removed myself from the family group chat. For the first time in 15 years, I wouldn't know about their weekend plans, their minor crises, their requests for assistance, or their casual discussions about my inadequacies. The silence felt like shedding a heavy coat I'd been wearing in summer heat, immediate relief and a wondering why I'd carried that weight for so long. The next few days brought a flurry of attempts to re-establish contact. Dad called from different numbers when his usual calls went straight to voicemail. Aunt Linda sent friend requests on social media platforms I rarely used. Michael texted from Ashley's phone asking if I was okay because people were concerned about my isolation. Each attempt was framed as concern for my well-being, but the underlying message was clear. They needed their problem solver back and were willing to use emotional manipulation to get her. But I was beginning to understand that their concern wasn't for me as a person, it was for me as a function. They weren't worried that I might be struggling with recovery, or processing trauma, or dealing with legitimate depression after a major medical event. They were worried that I might not resume my role as the family's unpaid support staff. Their love had always been conditional on my usefulness, and my reduced usefulness was threatening the entire foundation of our relationships. The realization was devastating and liberating in equal measure. Devastating because it meant acknowledging that the family relationships I'd centered my life around had never been real. Liberating because it meant I could stop performing for an audience that had never been genuinely watching. I could stop auditioning for roles in other people's lives and start writing my own story instead. By Thursday, the attempts at contact had escalated to showing up at my apartment unannounced. I came home from a follow-up appointment with my cardiologist to find Dad sitting in the lobby of my building, looking simultaneously angry and pathetic. "Maya, this has gone far enough," he said, standing up as I entered. "We need to talk like adults." Adults. As if my decision to prioritize my cardiac recovery over his cable installation needs was childish. As if my expectation of family support during a medical crisis was immature. As if my refusal to accept emotional abuse was a tantrum rather than self-preservation. The language was calculated to make me feel guilty for having boundaries, the same emotional manipulation that had worked for decades. But this time, something was different. This time I looked at my father and saw not the man I'd spent my life trying to please, but a person who was primarily concerned with restoring his access to my resources. His concern for my well-being was actually concern for his own convenience. His desire to talk like adults was actually a desire to return to a dynamic where his needs were automatically prioritized over mine. "Dad," I said calmly, "I'm following my doctor's orders for stress reduction during cardiac recovery. Having this conversation would be bad for my health." It was true. Dr. Mitchell had been explicit about avoiding stressful situations during the healing process, but it was also the first time I'd ever used my legitimate medical needs as a boundary with my family. It felt like speaking a foreign language that I was surprised to discover I was fluent in. His face went through several emotions in rapid succession: surprise, frustration, anger, and finally a calculated sadness that I recognized as his go-to manipulation technique. "Maya, you're my daughter. You can't just cut your family out of your life because of some misunderstanding. We love you." Some misunderstanding. Love. The words felt like physical assault after everything I'd learned about how they discussed me in private. But I wasn't the same person who would have crumbled at those words just 2 weeks earlier. "If you love me," I said quietly, "then you'll respect my need to focus on my health right now." I walked past him toward the elevator, and for the first time in my life, I didn't turn around when he called my name. I didn't apologize for disappointing him. I didn't offer a compromise or alternative timeline for when I might be available to resume normal family service. The elevator doors closed on his protests, and as I rode up to my floor, I realized that I'd just had my first honest conversation with my father in decades. Not honest because I'd told him everything I was thinking, I hadn't, but honest because I'd refused to pretend that our relationship was something it wasn't. I'd stopped performing the role of the grateful daughter who existed to solve his problems, and for the first time, we'd interacted as two adults with conflicting needs and priorities. It was terrifying and exhilarating and absolutely necessary. And as I unlocked my apartment door and stepped into the quiet sanctuary I was learning to call home, I knew there was no going back to the person I'd been before the heart attack. That Maya had nearly died in more ways than one. This Maya was going to live. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it began with a single phone call to Dr. Patricia Williams on a rainy Thursday morning exactly 3 weeks after my heart attack. I'd been sitting in my apartment for days, processing the weight of everything I'd discovered about my family's true feelings, when I realized that anger alone wasn't going to rebuild my life. I needed professional help to understand how I'd become so invested in relationships that only existed on my side, and more importantly, how to create genuine connections moving forward. Dr. Williams had a warm voice and an office that smelled like lavender and hope. During our first session, she asked me a question that no one had ever asked before. "Maya, what do you want your life to look like when you're not organizing it around other people's needs?" The question was so foreign to my thinking that I literally couldn't answer it. I'd spent so many years defining myself through my usefulness to others that I'd lost touch with my own desires, preferences, and dreams. "I don't know," I admitted, and the honesty felt like confession. "I've been taking care of everyone else for so long that I'm not sure who I am when I'm not doing that." Dr. Williams nodded as if this was the most natural thing in the world, as if losing yourself in service to others was a common enough phenomenon that it had a name and a treatment plan. Over the following weeks, therapy became my lifeline to understanding how I'd ended up in such a one-sided dynamic with my family. We talked about trauma bonding, about how losing my mother at 19 had made me desperate to maintain the remaining family connections at any cost. We discussed codependency, about how my need to be needed had made me an easy target for people who were happy to take without giving. Most importantly, we explored the difference between love and obligation, between genuine care and emotional manipulation. The homework Dr. Williams gave me was revolutionary in its simplicity: spend time alone doing things I enjoyed without considering anyone else's needs or opinions. It sounded easy, but after decades of people-pleasing, I discovered I had no idea what I actually liked. Did I enjoy cooking, or did I only cook because others expected it? Did I like hosting gatherings, or did I do it because it was the only way to guarantee family inclusion? Did I genuinely prefer giving expensive gifts, or was I trying to purchase affection? The process of rediscovering my authentic preferences was like archaeological work, carefully excavating my real personality from under layers of performance and accommodation. I spent a Saturday afternoon at a bookstore, wandering the aisles without any agenda other than seeing what caught my attention. I discovered that I loved mystery novels, something I'd never had time to explore because I'd always been reading self-help books about how to be a better daughter, sister, and family member. I bought 3 mystery novels that day, and spent the entire weekend reading, ordering takeout, and ignoring my phone completely. It was the first weekend in years that I hadn't checked in with anyone or made myself available for emergencies or last-minute requests. The quiet was so profound it was almost disorienting, like finally hearing silence after years of constant noise. Monday brought a voicemail from Aunt Linda that perfectly illustrated how thoroughly my family misunderstood the changes I was making. "Maya, honey, I know you're going through a rough patch, but isolating yourself isn't healthy. Why don't you come over for dinner Sunday? I'm making your favorite chicken casserole, and Michael will be there with his new girlfriend. It'll be good for you to get back to normal family time." Normal family time, the phrase made my chest tight in a way that had nothing to do with cardiac recovery. Linda's invitation sounded caring on the surface, but I could hear the underlying assumption that my absence from family events was a problem to be solved rather than a choice to be respected. She wasn't offering support for my recovery, she was offering to restore the previous dynamic where I participated in family activities while receiving minimal consideration for my own needs. I didn't return her call. Instead, I spent that Sunday at the Desert Botanical Garden, walking slowly through the cactus displays and letting the Arizona sunshine warm my face. It was the first Sunday in years that I hadn't spent cooking for others or attending obligatory family gatherings where I performed happiness while feeling increasingly invisible. The solitude felt like healing, like finally giving my nervous system permission to relax after decades of hypervigilance about everyone else's emotional states. The breakthrough moment came during my 4th therapy session when Dr. Williams asked me to write a letter to my family explaining my perspective, with no intention of sending it. "Sometimes," she said, "we need to hear ourselves say the truth out loud before we can figure out what to do with it." The letter took me 3 hours to write, and covered 6 pages of legal pad paper with everything I'd never been allowed to say. I wrote about the laughing emoji and how it had revealed their complete inability to take my pain seriously. I wrote about overhearing Ashley's balcony conversation and learning that they viewed my generosity as manipulation rather than love. I wrote about 15 years of financial contributions that had been accepted without gratitude and emotional support that had never been reciprocated. Most importantly, I wrote about the crushing loneliness of loving people who only valued me for what I could provide. Writing the letter was like performing surgery on my own heart, but this time it was healing surgery rather than emergency intervention. Each sentence released years of accumulated hurt and resentment that I'd been carrying around like poison in my bloodstream. By the time I finished, I was crying harder than I had since the night in the hospital when I'd realized my family wasn't coming, but these were different tears. Clean tears, relief tears. The tears of someone finally telling the truth about her own life. Dr. Williams read the letter during our next session and said something that changed everything. "Maya, this letter describes emotional abuse. You've been systematically trained to provide resources and support while accepting minimal care in return. That's not a family dynamic, that's exploitation." Hearing a professional name what I'd experienced gave me permission to stop minimizing it. I hadn't been overly sensitive or demanding. I'd been systematically abused by people who'd convinced me to call it love. The decision to cut contact completely came gradually, like sunrise rather than lightning. It started with blocking more phone numbers when the calls became increasingly aggressive and guilt-laden. Dad began leaving voicemails that escalated from disappointed to angry to desperate, cycling through every emotional manipulation technique he'd ever used successfully. Jake's text became threatening, suggesting that I was having a breakdown and needed intervention from people who cared about me. But it was Ashley's final attempt at contact that sealed my decision. She showed up at my apartment building on a Tuesday evening with Tyler in tow, calculating correctly that I'd have a harder time refusing entry to my 8-year-old nephew. When the lobby security called up to announce them, I felt my heart rate spike in a way that worried me from a medical perspective. My body was literally warning me that this interaction would be dangerous for my recovery. "I'm not available for visitors right now," I told the security guard, and heard Ashley's voice in the background demanding to know why I was hiding from family. "Please tell them I'm following doctor's orders for stress reduction during cardiac recovery." It was true, but it was also the first time I'd used my legitimate medical needs as a shield against family manipulation. The security guard professionally relayed my message, and after several minutes of Ashley's protests echoing through the lobby phone, they finally left. The relief I felt was overwhelming and telling. My body's stress response to family contact was so severe that avoiding them felt like literally life-saving behavior. Dr. Williams confirmed what I was beginning to understand, that continuing to engage with people who caused me physiological distress could actually interfere with my cardiac healing. My heart couldn't recover in an environment of chronic emotional stress. That night, I made the decision that would define the rest of my life. I changed my phone number, updated my emergency contacts at work and with my medical providers, and sent a single text to each family member from my old number. "I'm focusing on my health and won't be available for contact. Please respect this boundary." Then I turned off the old phone forever. The silence that followed was initially terrifying. For the first week, I kept reaching for my phone to check for family crisis messages or calls for help that weren't coming to my new number. I felt phantom vibrations and imagined emergencies that I wasn't being notified about. The absence of family drama created a void that I didn't immediately know how to fill, but gradually, the silence became sanctuary. I woke up in the morning without immediately checking for overnight emergencies or financial requests. I made weekend plans without considering family obligations or last-minute crises. I bought groceries based on what I wanted to eat rather than what I might need to cook for others. For the first time in my adult life, my time and resources were entirely my own. The practical changes were immediate and dramatic. Without monthly financial bailouts for family members, I suddenly had money for things I'd always considered luxuries. I bought a membership to the yoga studio I'd been wanting to try for years. I enrolled in a creative writing class at the community college. I hired a housekeeper to come twice a month, not because I couldn't clean my own apartment, but because I deserved to spend my free time on activities I enjoyed rather than endless household maintenance. But the emotional changes were even more profound. I started sleeping through the night without anxiety about what crisis might interrupt my rest. I stopped jumping every time my phone rang, no longer conditioned to expect that every call would bring someone else's emergency for me to solve. My resting heart rate, which Dr. Mitchell had been monitoring closely, dropped to normal ranges for the first time since my early 20s. 6 weeks into my new life, I met Emma at the yoga studio. She was a former nurse who'd left healthcare to become a yoga instructor after her own burnout experience, and something about her calm energy reminded me of what peace felt like. After class one evening, we grabbed coffee and talked about the challenge of rebuilding your life after realizing that your previous version hadn't been sustainable. "The hardest part," Emma said, stirring honey into her tea, "is learning to trust that people can like you for who you are rather than what you do for them. When you've been conditioned to earn love through service, receiving unconditional friendship feels too good to be true." Her words perfectly captured what I'd been struggling with. I kept waiting for Emma to ask me for money or favors or solutions to her problems, but she never did. She just seemed to enjoy my company, a concept so foreign to my experience that I almost couldn't accept it. But Emma was patient with my learning curve around healthy relationships. When I automatically offered to pay for dinner, she gently insisted on splitting the check. When I apologized excessively for minor inconveniences like being 5 minutes late, she helped me recognize the people-pleasing behavior and practice simple acknowledgement instead of elaborate apologies. Most importantly, when I shared carefully edited versions of my family situation, she validated my feelings without trying to fix anything or offering unwanted advice. Through Emma, I met other women who'd had to rebuild their lives after various traumas and transitions. There was Carmen, who'd left an abusive marriage and was learning to make decisions based on her own preferences rather than fear of someone else's anger. There was Diane, who'd retired from a demanding career and was discovering hobbies and interests that had nothing to do with professional achievement. There was Sophia, who'd survived cancer and was intentionally surrounding herself with people who valued her presence rather than her productivity. These women became my chosen family, the people who celebrated my recovery milestones and checked in on my emotional well-being without expecting anything in return. They taught me that healthy relationships involved mutual care, reciprocal support, and genuine interest in each other's happiness. They showed me what it felt like to be valued for my personality, humor, and friendship rather than my ability to solve problems or provide resources. 3 months after cutting contact with my biological family, I started a blog called Second Chances After 35. I wrote about recovering from more than just heart surgery, about learning to recognize emotional abuse disguised as family obligation, about discovering your authentic self after decades of people-pleasing. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of women shared their own stories of one-sided family relationships, of being taken for granted by people who claimed to love them, of the guilt and relief that came with finally setting boundaries. The blog became a community where women supported each other through the difficult process of prioritizing their own well-being over others' convenience. We shared resources for therapy, celebrated small victories in boundary setting, and validated each other's experiences of family dysfunction. Most importantly, we proved to each other that it was possible to build meaningful connections based on mutual respect rather than obligation. My 6-month cardiac follow-up appointment brought news that Dr. Mitchell called remarkable. My heart had healed completely, my stress markers were in normal ranges, and my overall health indicators were better than they'd been in years. Whatever changes you've made in your life, he said, reviewing my test results, keep doing them. This is what recovery looks like when someone truly prioritizes their health. I didn't tell him that prioritizing my health had required cutting ties with my entire biological family. I didn't explain that my cardiac recovery had been inseparable from my emotional recovery, that healing my heart had required acknowledging that some relationships were literally toxic to my well-being. But I knew that my physical healing had been possible only because I'd finally removed the chronic stress of managing other people's emotional and financial emergencies. 1 year after my heart attack, I was living a life I couldn't have imagined during those dark days in the cardiac unit. I had genuine friendships based on mutual care and respect. I had hobbies and interests that had nothing to do with being useful to others. I had financial security because I was no longer funding other people's poor choices. Most importantly, I had self-respect based on my inherent worth as a person rather than my performance as a caretaker. The anniversary of my heart attack fell on a Tuesday, and I spent it exactly as I wanted to, sleeping late, reading mystery novels in my favorite coffee shop, and having dinner with Emma and Carmen at a restaurant I'd chosen because I loved their mushroom risotto. As we laughed over dessert, I realized that this was what happiness felt like when it wasn't conditional on other people's approval or dependent on managing their emotions. That evening, I wrote in my journal about the strange gift that my heart attack had turned out to be. Nearly dying had taught me how to live authentically for the first time in my adult life. The worst day of my life had led to the best year of my life, not despite the family estrangement, but because of it. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is walk away from people who can't love you back. I never heard from my biological family again, and I was grateful for their silence. Their absence from my life had created space for relationships that nourished rather than depleted me. Their rejection had freed me to find people who valued my presence rather than my presence. Their inability to love me had taught me how to love myself. As I fell asleep that night, listening to the quiet sounds of my neighborhood instead of my phone buzzing with family crises. I felt profound gratitude for the heart attack that had nearly killed me but had ultimately saved my life. Sometimes you have to lose everything to discover what actually matters. Sometimes you have to stop being who others need you to become who you were meant to be. Sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is the worst thing that can happen to you. My heart was stronger now, both physically and emotionally, and for the first time in 35 years, it belonged entirely to me. 2 years after my heart attack, I was standing in the kitchen of my new townhouse in Tempe, preparing dinner for people who actually wanted to be there, when my doorbell rang. Through the window, I could see a familiar silhouette that made my stomach drop despite all the therapy and healing I'd done. Jake stood on my doorstep, older and somehow smaller than I remembered, holding what looked like a greeting card in his hands. I hadn't spoken to any member of my biological family since the day I'd changed my phone number and disappeared from their lives. 2 years of peace, growth, and authentic relationships had given me perspective on just how toxic that dynamic had been. But seeing Jake now, uninvited on my property after I'd explicitly asked for no contact, I felt my carefully constructed serenity wobble like a house of cards in an earthquake. My first instinct was the old Maya response: open the door, listen to whatever crisis had brought him here, probably end up writing a check or providing emotional labor despite my boundaries. But the new Maya, the one who'd learned that love doesn't require self-destruction, stayed exactly where she was. I watched through the window as Jake rang the bell again, then knocked, then cupped his hands against the glass, trying to see inside. Emma was in my living room setting up a yoga mat for our Tuesday evening practice session. Carmen was in the bathroom touching up her makeup before we all went out for Thai food. Diane was on my back patio watering the garden we'd planted together last spring. These were my people now. The women who'd shown me what reciprocal relationships looked like, who celebrated my successes without expecting credit, who supported me during difficult moments without keeping score. Maya? Emma called from the living room, having heard the persistent doorbell. Do you want me to get that? The offer was casual but protective, the way real friends shield each other from unwanted intrusions. I shook my head and walked to where I could see her, my heart rate elevated but manageable, my breathing steady despite the surprise. It's my brother, I said simply. The one I told you about. Emma's expression shifted immediately from curiosity to understanding. She knew the story of the laughing emoji, the family's complete absence during my medical crisis, the years of financial exploitation disguised as family obligation. She also knew how much work I'd done to heal from those relationships and build something better. Do you want us to stay? Carmen asked, appearing in the hallway with her purse slung over her shoulder. We can hang out until he leaves. The offer was made without drama or judgment, just practical support from someone who understood that past trauma can resurface unexpectedly, and that having backup during difficult moments isn't weakness, it's wisdom. I considered the option but realized I wasn't afraid of Jake anymore. Not afraid of his manipulation, his guilt trips, or his ability to make me feel responsible for his problems. The woman who used to crumble at his disappointment had been replaced by someone who understood her own worth independent of his approval. No, I think I'll just wait for him to leave. He doesn't get to demand access to my space anymore. The three of us watched through various windows as Jake spent 20 minutes trying different approaches to gain entry. He rang the bell repeatedly, knocked with increasing intensity, walked around the perimeter of my townhouse looking for other doors or windows, and finally sat down on my front steps like a determined protester. His persistence revealed everything about how he still viewed our relationship. His needs were automatically more important than my clearly stated boundaries. After an hour of his vigil, Carmen suggested we leave through the back gate and go to dinner as planned. Don't let his tantrum control your evening, she said, and I realized she was absolutely right. Jake's attempt to force contact was just another version of the emotional manipulation I'd escaped, and giving him power over my plans would be returning to the old dynamic where his comfort mattered more than mine. We slipped out the back way and spent the evening at our favorite Thai restaurant, laughing over pad Thai and discussing Carmen's new photography hobby. It was exactly the kind of evening I'd learned to cherish, low-key, authentic, and focused on mutual enjoyment, rather than anyone's crisis or agenda. When we returned 3 hours later, Jake was gone, but the greeting card he'd been holding was wedged into my doorframe. I almost threw it away without opening it, recognizing that whatever message it contained was likely designed to manipulate me back into contact. But curiosity won, and I opened the card while Emma and Carmen finished loading my dishwasher, their presence a reminder that I no longer had to face family dysfunction alone. The card was one of those generic thinking of you designs with pastel flowers and meaningless sentiment. Inside, Jake had written what appeared to be a carefully crafted apology that hit every note of manipulation I'd learned to recognize in therapy. He was sorry for any misunderstandings and hoped we could move past this difficult period because family is forever, and he missed having me in their lives. But it was the final paragraph that revealed his true motivation. Dad's not doing well financially since Mom died last year, and we could really use your help getting back on track. Ashley and I have been covering what we can, but you know how good you've always been at handling these situations. Can we talk about coming together as a family again? Mom died last year. The words hit me like a physical blow, not because I felt grief for a woman who'd abandoned us decades ago, but because it revealed the calculated nature of Jake's visit. Our mother, who'd walked out when I was 13 and Jake was 7, had apparently returned to their lives at some point, and recently passed away. Jake wasn't here because he missed me or felt genuine remorse about his behavior during my heart attack. He was here because they needed money and I'd always been their most reliable source. The letter made no mention of my cardiac event, my recovery, or the 2 years of silence they'd endured after treating my medical emergency like a joke. There was no acknowledgement of the laughing emoji, no recognition of their failure to provide support when I'd nearly died, no curiosity about my current life or well-being. Just another request for financial assistance wrapped in the language of family obligation. Emma read the letter over my shoulder and whistled low. Wow, he managed to mention your mom's death and ask for money in the same paragraph. That's actually impressive in how completely tone-deaf it is. Her observation was delivered with the kind of clear-eyed analysis that had helped me recognize manipulation in the past. No emotional dramatics, no outrage, just factual assessment of what we were dealing with. Carmen looked up from my kitchen counter where she'd been organizing my mail. Maya, you know this is exactly what Dr. Williams warned you about, right? The crisis contact designed to pull you back in when they need something. She was referring to my therapist's prediction that my family would eventually reach out when they faced problems they couldn't solve without my resources. The prediction had been so accurate it was almost eerie. Dr. Williams had explained that people who exploit others financially rarely manage their own resources, so they inevitably face crises that require their former victims' intervention. She'd warned me that these contact attempts would be designed to trigger guilt, nostalgia, and my deeply ingrained sense of family obligation. But Dr. Williams had also prepared me for this moment by helping me recognize that their crisis didn't constitute my emergency. Dad's financial problems weren't my responsibility, especially given their complete absence during my own life-threatening health crisis. Their inability to manage money wasn't my fault, and my recovery from their emotional abuse didn't obligate me to return to funding their poor decisions. That night, after Emma and Carmen had gone home, I sat in my home office and wrote a response to Jake's letter. Not because I intended to send it, but because Dr. Williams had taught me that writing unsent letters helped clarify my thoughts and strengthen my resolve. The process had been invaluable during my early recovery when I'd been tempted to return to familiar patterns of people-pleasing and crisis management. Jake, I wrote, I received your letter asking for financial help and suggesting we move past our difficulties. I want to be clear about why that's not possible. 2 years ago, when I had a heart attack at 35 and nearly died, you responded to my emergency text with a laughing emoji. While I was in intensive care wondering if I'd survive, you were planning family trips that deliberately excluded me and discussing how my medical crisis was inconvenient for your schedule. The words flowed easily, 2 years of therapy having given me vocabulary for experiences I'd never been able to articulate. You didn't visit me in the hospital, call to check on my recovery, or acknowledge the severity of what happened. Instead, you asked me to run errands while I was on cardiac rest and then became angry when I prioritized my health over your convenience. That wasn't a misunderstanding or a difficult period. It was a revelation of how little my life meant to you. I continued writing, documenting the pattern of financial exploitation that had preceded my heart attack, the emotional abuse that had followed it, and the peace I'd found since removing myself from their dysfunction. I've learned that family isn't defined by shared genetics, but by mutual care and respect. The people who love me showed up during my medical crisis without being asked and continue to support my well-being without expecting payment in return. The final paragraph felt like closing a door that had been open for 35 years. I'm not available to resume my role as the family ATM, and I won't be responding to future contact attempts. I wish you well in solving your own problems with your own resources. I signed it simply Maya, and then deleted the entire document. The act of writing it had been therapeutic, but Jake didn't deserve the energy required to craft actual communication. Instead, I did something that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier. I threw his letter away and forgot about it. Not the dramatic, emotional forgetting that requires constant mental effort, but the quiet, natural forgetting that comes when something simply isn't important to your current life. Jake's financial crisis wasn't my emergency, and his attempt to manipulate me back into contact was just background noise in a life that had become genuinely fulfilling. The next few months brought additional attempts at contact that followed a predictable escalation pattern. Aunt Linda sent a Facebook friend request along with a message about family healing and letting go of past hurts. Michael texted from a new number asking if I'd received Jake's letter and whether I was ready to be reasonable about the family situation. Dad himself finally reached out through a mutual acquaintance, asking her to relay his message that he was proud of how independent I'd become, but hoped I wouldn't abandon family completely. Each attempt was carefully designed to trigger different aspects of my conditioning: guilt about family loyalty, fear of being seen as selfish, nostalgia for positive memories, and concern about missing out on family connection. But therapy had inoculated me against these manipulation techniques by helping me recognize them as strategies rather than genuine emotion. When someone tells you they're proud of your independence while simultaneously asking you to give it up for their benefit, the contradiction reveals their true motivation. More tellingly, none of these contact attempts included any acknowledgement of my heart attack, curiosity about my recovery, or interest in my current well-being. They were all variations on the same theme: we need your money and services, please resume your previous role as family problem solver. The complete absence of genuine care or interest in me as a person confirmed everything I'd learned about the conditional nature of their affection. By the 3rd year after my heart attack, I'd stopped anticipating family contact attempts and started focusing entirely on the life I was building with people who chose to be there. Emma and I had become business partners, opening a wellness center that combined yoga instruction with workshops on boundary setting and emotional recovery. Carmen had moved into a townhouse 2 streets over, and we'd developed a friendship that included everything from emergency pet sitting to vacation travel. Diane had introduced me to her book club, where I'd discovered a love for literary fiction that had nothing to do with self-improvement or problem-solving. I'd started dating again, cautiously but authentically, no longer approaching relationships as opportunities to prove my worth through service. My new partner Marcus was a high school teacher who valued emotional intelligence and mutual respect, who brought flowers just because and listened to my stories without trying to fix anything. The wellness center had become more successful than we'd imagined, partly because there were apparently thousands of women dealing with similar family dysfunction and desperate for community with others who understood. Our workshops on recognizing emotional manipulation filled up within hours of being announced. Our support groups for adult children of narcissistic families had waiting lists. Most importantly, we'd created a space where women could practice healthy relationships in real time, learning to give and receive care without keeping score. One afternoon, while reviewing applications for our scholarship program, which provided free services to women escaping abusive family dynamics, I realized something profound about my journey. The heart attack that had nearly killed me had ultimately saved me from a life of emotional servitude disguised as family love. Nearly dying had taught me the difference between being needed and being valued, between being useful and being cherished. The Maya who'd stood on that doorstep with pie in her hands, desperate for inclusion in family celebrations that treated her like hired help, felt like a different person entirely. She'd been so afraid of being alone that she'd accepted being lonely within her family relationships, so desperate for belonging that she'd paid for the privilege of being ignored. That woman had been generous to a fault and loyal beyond reason, but she'd never learned to love herself enough to demand reciprocal treatment. This Maya had learned that solitude was preferable to bad company, that self-respect was more valuable than others' approval, and that authentic connection required mutual investment. She'd discovered that saying no to people who didn't value her freed up space for people who did. Most importantly, she'd learned that family could be chosen as well as inherited, and that chosen family often loved more reliably than biological relatives. 4 years after my heart attack, I was featured in a local magazine article about women who'd transformed their lives after major health scares. The reporter asked me what advice I'd give to others facing similar crossroads, and my answer surprised even me with its clarity. Sometimes the people who hurt you most are the ones closest to you, I said. And sometimes walking away from family isn't abandonment, it's survival. The article generated hundreds of responses from women sharing their own stories of family dysfunction and the difficulty of setting boundaries with relatives who'd trained them to accept mistreatment. Many had experienced their own wake-up calls: divorce, job loss, medical crises, or simply reaching an age where they could no longer ignore their own unhappiness. All were struggling with the same central question: how do you rebuild your life when the people who should support you are actually the ones holding you back? Through the Wellness Center, I'd been able to help dozens of women navigate that transition, and their success stories had become my greatest source of satisfaction. Watching someone discover their own worth after years of being treated as disposable, seeing them build healthy relationships after escaping toxic family dynamics, witnessing their transformation from people pleasers into self-advocates, these experiences reminded me daily why my own journey had been necessary. The 5th anniversary of my heart attack fell on a Tuesday, exactly as it had 5 years earlier, but everything else about my life was unrecognizable. Instead of lying alone in a hospital bed wondering why my family hadn't come, I was surrounded by people who'd traveled from across the country to celebrate my recovery and the life I'd built afterward. Emma had organized the gathering, Carmen had cooked my favorite meal, Diane had created a photo album documenting our adventures together, and Marcus had written me a poem about the courage required to start over at 35. As we sat around my dining room table sharing stories and laughter, I felt overwhelming gratitude for the heart attack that had nearly ended my life, but had ultimately begun it. The medical crisis had stripped away all pretense and revealed the truth about my family relationships, forcing me to choose between continuing to enable their dysfunction or prioritizing my own well-being. The choice had been terrifying at the time, but it had led to everything good in my current life. The women around my table, the business we'd built together, the community we'd created for others escaping similar situations, the romantic relationship based on equality rather than service, none of it would have existed if I'd continued pouring my energy into people who couldn't value it appropriately. That evening, as my friends helped clean up after the celebration, I found myself thinking about the letter I'd never sent to Jake 3 years earlier. The anger and hurt I'd felt then had transformed into something closer to indifference, not because I'd forced myself to forgive, but because their opinion of me had simply stopped mattering. The most profound revenge isn't destruction, it's building something so beautiful that your former abusers become irrelevant to your happiness. I never heard from my biological family again after Jake's letter, and their silence had become one of my greatest blessings. Without their constant crises to manage, their emotional needs to meet, and their financial emergencies to solve, I'd discovered capacities within myself that had been dormant for decades. I was funnier than I'd realized, more creative than I'd imagined, and more capable of inspiring others than I'd ever dreamed. The heart attack that should have ended my story had actually begun it, teaching me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is love yourself enough to walk away from people who can't love you back. My heart was stronger now, both medically and metaphorically, protected by boundaries that kept out toxicity, and surrounded by people who understood that real love multiplies when shared rather than diminishing when given. As I locked my front door that night and looked around my beautiful home, filled with evidence of authentic relationships and meaningful work, I whispered a thank you to the universe for almost killing me 5 years earlier. Sometimes destruction precedes construction, sometimes endings enable beginnings, and sometimes the worst thing that ever happens to you turns out to be the best thing that ever happened to you. My name is Maya Thompson, and I survived more than a heart attack. I survived a family that confused obligation with love, service with value, and need with affection. But most importantly, I discovered that walking away from people who hurt you isn't giving up on love, it's making room for the real thing. 7 years after my heart attack, I was standing in the conference room of Phoenix Children's Hospital, presenting my wellness center's new program for teens dealing with family trauma, when the hospital administrator mentioned something that stopped me cold. "We're actually partnering with Banner University Medical Center on this initiative," she said casually, "since they handle the adult cardiac cases that sometimes involve family crisis situations." Banner University Medical Center. The same hospital where I'd nearly died 7 years ago, where I'd waited in vain for my family to visit, where I'd learned that love and obligation were not the same thing. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now working with the very institution where my transformation had begun, helping other families navigate crises with more compassion than I'd received. Dr. Mitchell, my former cardiologist, was in the meeting representing Banner's medical team. He'd aged in the years since my recovery, his hair now completely silver, but his eyes still held the same kindness that had helped me through those dark days in the cardiac unit. When he saw me across the conference table, his face lit up with genuine warmth. "Maya Thompson," he said during a break in presentations, "I have to tell you, you're one of my greatest success stories. Not just medically, but holistically. I've followed your work through the Wellness Center, and what you've built is extraordinary." His words carried weight because Dr. Mitchell had seen me at my lowest point, when I'd been broken both physically and emotionally, wondering if anyone would ever truly care about my well-being. "You know," he continued, lowering his voice, "I remember those first few days after your surgery. You were healing beautifully from a medical standpoint, but there was something else going on. I could tell you were dealing with more than just cardiac recovery." His observation was gentle but perceptive. He'd recognized what I hadn't been able to articulate at the time, that my heart attack had revealed a deeper sickness in my life, that had nothing to do with blocked arteries. "I've learned a lot since then," I said simply, "about what healing really means." Dr. Mitchell nodded with the understanding that comes from seeing hundreds of patients navigate life-altering medical events. Some emerged stronger, some remained broken, and some, like me, discovered that their crisis had actually been a gift in disguise. The meeting continued with discussions about integrating emotional support services into medical treatment, acknowledging that physical healing often required addressing psychological and social factors. My wellness center would be providing counselors trained in family dynamics and trauma recovery to work with cardiac patients whose support systems were inadequate or harmful. It was the kind of program I wished had existed during my own recovery. After the meeting, Dr. Mitchell walked with me to the parking garage, and our conversation turned to the broader patterns he'd observed in his decades of practice. You'd be surprised how many cardiac patients have stories similar to yours, he said. Medical crises reveal family dynamics that were previously hidden or ignored. The stress of potentially losing someone shows you who they really are to the people in their lives. His words resonated deeply, because I'd met dozens of women through the wellness center who'd had similar experiences. Heart attacks, cancer diagnoses, accidents, mental health crises, all had served as litmus tests for their relationships, revealing which connections were genuine and which were transactional. The women who'd survived and thrived were usually the ones who'd used their health scares as opportunities to rebuild their support systems around people who actually supported them. I've always wondered, Dr. Mitchell said as we reached my car, what happened with your family situation? I remember those first few days when you were alone, and it concerned me from a recovery standpoint. Patients with strong family support heal faster and have better long-term outcomes. His clinical curiosity was paired with genuine care, and I found myself wanting to give him the closure he'd never received about my case. They never came, I said simply. My brother responded to my emergency text with a laughing emoji. They thought my heart attack was attention-seeking behavior, and used my hospitalization as an opportunity to plan family events that excluded me. The words came out matter-of-factly without the emotional charge they'd once carried. 7 years of healing had transformed those memories from open wounds into historical facts. Dr. Mitchell's expression shifted from curiosity to something closer to professional horror. As someone who dedicated his career to saving lives, the idea that family members would mock a life-threatening medical emergency was probably incomprehensible to him. Maya, I'm so sorry, that must have been devastating during an already traumatic time. It was devastating, I agreed, but it was also clarifying. Sometimes you need a crisis to show you what's actually in your life, versus what you thought was there. My heart attack revealed that I'd been loving people who weren't capable of loving me back, and accepting that truth freed me to find people who could. We talked for another 20 minutes about the connection between emotional healing and physical recovery, about the importance of boundaries in maintaining health, and about the challenge of rebuilding your life when your foundation turns out to have been built on sand. Dr. Mitchell shared his own observations about patients who'd used medical crises as catalysts for positive life changes, versus those who'd returned to the same toxic patterns that had contributed to their health problems. What you've accomplished, he said finally, goes far beyond recovering from cardiac surgery. You've created an entirely new life based on authentic relationships and genuine self-care. That takes tremendous courage, especially when it means walking away from family. His validation meant more to me than he could know, coming from someone who'd witnessed both my physical and emotional transformation. That evening, I drove past my old apartment building for the first time in years. The complex looked smaller than I remembered, the desert landscaping more weathered, the parking lot more cramped. I tried to imagine the woman who'd lived there 7 years ago, desperate for family approval and willing to sacrifice her health for their acceptance. She felt like a character from someone else's story, someone I'd known briefly but had outgrown completely. From there, I drove through Scottsdale, past the house where I'd grown up and later helped support financially for so many years. It was a modest ranch-style home in an older neighborhood, nothing special or extraordinary, but it had loomed so large in my emotional landscape for decades. Now it was just another house on another street, occupied by people who'd proven themselves incapable of basic human decency during my greatest crisis. I didn't feel anger or resentment looking at the house where my father probably still lived, where Jake and Ashley might still gather for holidays that I was no longer expected to fund. Instead, I felt something closer to anthropological curiosity, like observing the habitat of a species I'd once belonged to but had evolved beyond. These people had taught me everything I needed to know about what I didn't want in my life. The next morning brought news that would test everything I'd learned about boundaries and emotional independence. Emma burst into my office at the wellness center with her phone in her hand, looking stricken. "Maya, I don't know if you want to know this, but there's something online about your family." My stomach immediately tightened, the old conditioning of family crisis mode activating before my rational mind could intervene. She handed me her phone, opened to a local news website with a headline that made my breath catch: "Local Mandy's in home fire. Family seeks community support." The accompanying photo showed firefighters hosing down the remains of what had once been my childhood home. According to the article, Dad had died in the fire along with Jake, who'd apparently been living there since his divorce from Ashley the previous year. The article described them as beloved community members who'd been active in local charity work and mentioned a GoFundMe account set up by surviving family members to cover funeral expenses and help Ashley with unexpected financial hardship. The surviving family members quoted in the article were Aunt Linda and Michael, both of whom spoke about the tragic loss of two generous men who always put family first. I stared at the screen for several minutes, trying to process what I was reading. Dad and Jake were dead, killed in a house fire that had apparently started from electrical problems, possibly related to the deferred maintenance that had always been someone else's responsibility to fund. The house I'd helped pay for had burned down, taking with it the two people who'd laughed at my medical emergency and then demanded I resume supporting them financially. Emma was watching my face carefully, probably trying to gauge whether this news would trigger a grief response or send me spiraling back into family dysfunction. "How are you feeling?" she asked gently. "Do you want to talk about it?" Her concern was genuine but cautious, recognizing that death doesn't automatically erase years of emotional abuse or create obligations that hadn't existed when people were alive. "I'm not sure," I said honestly. "I think I'm mostly numb." The truth was that I felt like I was reading about strangers, people I'd known intimately once upon a time, but who'd become irrelevant to my daily existence. Their deaths were tragic in the abstract way that all premature deaths are tragic, but they didn't create a personal loss for me because I'd already grieved these relationships years earlier. What struck me most was the community response described in the article. Neighbors and acquaintances were sharing memories of Dad helping with yard work and Jake coaching Little League, painting them as pillars of the community who died too soon. The disconnect between their public personas and their private cruelty was jarring but not surprising. People who abuse family members often maintain excellent reputations with outsiders who never see their true behavior. The GoFundMe account had already raised several $1,000s, with donors leaving comments about the wonderful family and their devastating loss. I found myself wondering if any of these generous strangers knew that Dad and Jake had responded to their family member's heart attack with mockery and indifference. Probably not. The version of them that existed in public had always been different from the version that existed in private. Carmen arrived at the wellness center within an hour of Emma calling her, immediately wrapping me in the kind of supportive presence that had become second nature among my chosen family. "Whatever you're feeling is okay," she said simply. "Grief is complicated, especially when it involves people who hurt you. There's no right way to process this." Her words gave me permission to feel confused rather than forcing myself into an emotional response that seemed appropriate. I wasn't devastated by their deaths, but I wasn't relieved either. Mostly I felt a strange sense of closure, as if a chapter that had already ended was now officially finished. The people who'd been unable to love me were gone, and with them, any possibility of reconciliation or apology that I'd never wanted anyway. Diane joined us for an impromptu support session, bringing takeout and tissues and the kind of practical wisdom that comes from having navigated her own share of complicated grief. "You know," she said, settling into the comfortable chair where she led our Thursday night book discussions, "sometimes death is just death. It doesn't have to mean forgiveness or regret or any particular emotion. Sometimes people die and you're just done with them already." Her observation was liberating because it gave me permission to not perform grief for people who'd never performed love for me. Dad and Jake's deaths didn't erase their behavior during my heart attack or create retroactive family bonds that hadn't existed when they were alive. Death doesn't transform bad people into good people or abusive relationships into loving ones. It just makes everything final. Over the next few days, I monitored the online fundraising and community response from a distance, fascinated by how thoroughly their public narrative differed from my lived experience. The GoFundMe description painted them as devoted family men who'd always been there for each other through thick and thin, and who'd never hesitated to help anyone in need. The comments section was filled with stories about their generosity and community involvement, their willingness to lend tools or help with moving or provide rides to medical appointments. I read these tributes with genuine curiosity, wondering if there had been a completely different version of Dad and Jake that I'd never known, or if their kindness had simply been reserved for people who weren't expected to provide it in return. Ashley's interview with the local news station revealed everything I needed to know about the continuing family dynamics. She spoke tearfully about her devastating loss and the financial hardship of raising Tyler alone, mentioning that Jake had been supporting them since their divorce. She also mentioned that there had been some family estrangement in recent years, but that she hoped this tragedy might bring everyone back together. Everyone, she was talking about me. Even in death, they were still trying to manipulate me back into the role of family problem solver. Ashley's public grief performance was designed to create social pressure for me to emerge from my self-imposed exile and provide financial support for her and Tyler. The GoFundMe account wasn't just about funeral expenses, it was about replacing the income stream that had died with Jake. But the most revealing detail was buried in a follow-up article about the fire investigation. The electrical problems that had caused the blaze were traced to DIY repairs that had been done incorrectly, creating fire hazards throughout the house. Jake had apparently been attempting to save money on professional electrical work by doing it himself, with predictably catastrophic results. The irony was devastating. For years, I'd provided financial assistance that could have paid for proper home maintenance and professional repairs. My contributions to rent, utilities, and various emergencies could have prevented the deferred maintenance that ultimately killed them. By cutting off their access to my resources, I'd inadvertently contributed to the circumstances that led to their deaths. But even recognizing this connection, I couldn't bring myself to feel responsible for their choices. They'd had 7 years to learn how to manage their finances without exploiting me. They'd had countless opportunities to develop emergency funds, seek professional help for electrical problems, or simply treat me with enough basic respect that I might have been willing to help in a genuine crisis. Instead, they'd doubled down on the same patterns that had driven me away in the first place. Jake had apparently never learned to budget properly or prioritize essential expenses over conveniences. Dad had apparently never developed the life skills necessary to maintain a household without someone else's financial backing. Their deaths were tragic, but they were also the inevitable result of choices they'd made consistently for years. 3 weeks after the fire, I received a call from an attorney representing Ashley's interests in settling Dad and Jake's estates. The lawyer explained that I was listed as a beneficiary in both wills, inheriting Dad's life insurance policy and Jake's retirement account. The combined inheritance was substantial, nearly $80,000, more than I'd given them in total financial support over the years. The lawyer also mentioned that Ashley was contesting both wills, claiming that recent family estrangement meant I should be considered to have predeceased both men for inheritance purposes. She was arguing that my self-imposed exile from the family constituted abandonment, and that Tyler, as Jake's son, should inherit everything instead of it being divided between Ashley and me. Thompson, the attorney, said during our phone consultation, "I have to ask, do you want to fight this contest? You have a strong legal position, but estate litigation can be expensive and emotionally draining. Some beneficiaries in your situation choose to walk away rather than engage in family conflict." His question was practical and sensitive, recognizing that money isn't always worth the cost of obtaining it. I thought about it for several days, discussing the situation with my therapist and my chosen family. The inheritance money could fund scholarship programs at the wellness center or support expansion of our services to other cities. It could also provide financial security that would allow me to take more risks with my advocacy work and writing, but claiming it would require engaging with Ashley's manipulation and likely enduring months of legal proceedings. Ultimately, I decided to accept the inheritance not because I needed the money, but because walking away would signal that their final attempt at manipulation had been successful. Dad and Jake had chosen to leave me money in their wills, probably as a hedge against future financial needs, or a final gesture of acknowledgement for years of support. Ashley's attempt to override their explicit wishes was just another version of the family dysfunction I'd escaped. The legal battle lasted 4 months and revealed everything about the continuing family dynamics. Ashley's attorney painted me as a selfish daughter who'd abandoned her family during their greatest time of need, emphasizing my absence during Dad's final years and my refusal to help with various financial crises. My attorney responded by documenting the pattern of financial exploitation and emotional abuse that had led to my withdrawal from family relationships. The most damning evidence came from medical records and therapy notes that detailed the impact of family stress on my cardiac recovery. Dr. Williams provided expert testimony about the health consequences of maintaining relationships with people who caused chronic emotional trauma. Dr. Mitchell submitted a statement explaining that family dysfunction could literally be life-threatening for cardiac patients, making my decision to limit contact a medical necessity rather than personal preference. But it was the discovery process that provided the most insight into how Dad and Jake had really viewed our relationships. Their financial records showed years of poor money management, impulse purchases, and expensive habits that had consumed not just their own income but the assistance I'd provided. Text messages recovered from Jake's phone revealed ongoing conversations with Ashley about strategies for re-establishing contact with me, all focused on their financial needs rather than any genuine desire for relationship repair. Most tellingly, Dad's personal papers included a notebook where he'd kept track of money I'd given him over the years, with calculations about how much more he might be able to extract if he could manage Maya's guilt better. The language was clinical and manipulative, treating my generosity as a resource to be exploited rather than a gift to be appreciated. When Ashley's contest was eventually dismissed and I inherited the full amount, I felt a complex mixture of vindication and sadness. Vindication because the legal system had recognized that my withdrawal from family relationships had been justified and reasonable. Sadness because the evidence presented during litigation had confirmed just how thoroughly my father and brother had viewed me as a resource rather than a person. I donated half the inheritance to organizations supporting women escaping family financial abuse, keeping the other half to establish an endowment for the wellness center that would ensure our services remained available regardless of economic fluctuations. The money that had been intended to manipulate me back into dysfunction became a tool for helping other women escape similar situations. The final irony came 6 months later when I received a letter from Tyler, now 14, and apparently old enough to understand some of what had happened to our family. His letter was different from the manipulation I'd experienced from the adults. It was genuine, curious, and surprisingly mature. He asked about my heart attack, apologized for his family's response, and wondered if we might be able to have some kind of relationship despite everything that had happened. "I know my dad and grandpa weren't very nice to you," he wrote in careful teenage handwriting. "Mom tries to make it sound like you just abandoned us, but I remember some of the things they said about you, and I remember you always bringing me presents and helping with stuff. I don't really understand what happened, but I'm sorry they made you feel bad." His letter was the first communication from any family member that acknowledged my perspective or expressed genuine concern for my well-being. It was also free from any requests for money or assistance, just a kid trying to understand why his family had fractured and whether repair might be possible. For the first time in years, I felt something resembling familial affection. I wrote back to Tyler carefully, explaining in age-appropriate terms that sometimes adults make choices that hurt the people who love them, and that taking care of your own mental health sometimes requires stepping away from harmful relationships. I told him about my heart attack and recovery, about the wellness center and the work I was doing to help other families communicate better. Most importantly, I told him that none of the family dysfunction was his fault, and that he deserved to be surrounded by people who treated him with kindness and respect. Our correspondence continued sporadically over the following months, with Tyler asking thoughtful questions about family dynamics, emotional health, and the process of setting boundaries. I sent him books about healthy relationships and recommended therapy resources when he mentioned struggling with his parents' deaths and his mother's ongoing financial stress. Our relationship was tentative but genuine, built on mutual respect rather than obligation. 9 years after my heart attack, I was invited to speak at a medical conference about the intersection of family dynamics and cardiac recovery. My presentation, titled "When Support Systems Become Stress Systems," explored how toxic family relationships could literally endanger physical health, and how medical professionals could better support patients dealing with dysfunctional family dynamics. The audience was primarily doctors, nurses, and social workers who'd witnessed similar situations in their practice but lacked frameworks for understanding or addressing them. I shared my story as a case study, explaining how my family's response to my medical emergency had revealed the transactional nature of our relationships and how cutting contact had been essential for my complete recovery. During the question and answer period, a nurse asked whether I ever regretted choosing my health over family relationships. The question was compassionate but revealed a common misconception about boundary setting that I'd encountered repeatedly in my advocacy work. I didn't choose my health over family relationships, I corrected gently. I chose my health over family dysfunction. People who truly love you don't make you choose between their approval and your well-being. When someone's presence in your life consistently threatens your physical or emotional health, maintaining that relationship isn't loyalty, it's self-destruction. After my presentation, dozens of medical professionals approached me with stories of their own patients who'd faced similar dilemmas. Many admitted they'd struggled with how to support patients whose families were more harmful than helpful, recognizing that traditional advice about family support might actually be counterproductive for some people. That conference led to consulting opportunities with hospitals and medical schools interested in training their staff to recognize and respond to family dysfunction in medical settings. I developed workshops for healthcare workers on supporting patients whose families were absent, abusive, or actively interfering with treatment. The work was deeply satisfying because it addressed a gap in medical care that I'd experienced firsthand. 10 years after my heart attack, I published a memoir called The Heart Remembers: Surviving Family, Finding Yourself. The book detailed my journey from people-pleasing daughter to self-advocating woman, exploring how medical trauma had catalyzed my escape from toxic family dynamics. But more than just a personal story, it was a guide for other women dealing with similar situations, offering practical advice on setting boundaries, recognizing manipulation, and building chosen families. The book's success surprised everyone, including me. It spent several weeks on bestseller lists and generated thousands of letters from women sharing their own stories of family dysfunction and recovery. Many had experienced their own wake-up calls, medical crises, job losses, divorces that had revealed the true nature of their family relationships. All were struggling with the same fundamental question: how do you rebuild your life when the people who should love you most are actually the ones hurting you most? The book tour took me across the country, speaking to audiences of women who'd survived various forms of family trauma and were working to create healthier relationships moving forward. Every event confirmed what I'd learned through the Wellness Center: there are thousands of women who've been conditioned to accept mistreatment from family members and who need permission to prioritize their own well-being. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from Tyler, now 18 and preparing for college. He sent me a text after reading the book: "I finally understand what happened with our family. I'm sorry they treated you that way, and I'm proud of you for choosing yourself. I hope I can be brave enough to make healthy choices about relationships too." His message represented everything I'd hoped to accomplish through sharing my story. Not revenge against people who'd hurt me, not public vindication of my choices, but education for the next generation about what healthy relationships actually look like. Tyler would enter adulthood with tools for recognizing manipulation and skills for setting boundaries that I'd had to learn the hard way. 15 years after my heart attack, I stood in the same hospital where my transformation had begun, but this time as a keynote speaker for a conference on family-centered care. The audience included many of the same medical professionals who might have treated me during my original crisis, people dedicated to supporting patients and families through difficult times. My message to them was simple but revolutionary. Sometimes the most family-centered care requires protecting patients from their families. Sometimes healing requires separation from people who claim to love you but consistently cause harm. Sometimes the most loving thing a medical professional can do is validate a patient's decision to prioritize their own well-being over family expectations. The heart attack that nearly killed me had actually saved my life by forcing me to confront the difference between love and exploitation, between family and dysfunction, between loyalty and self-destruction. It had taught me that walking away from people who hurt you isn't giving up on love, it's making room for the real thing. As I looked out at the audience of medical professionals dedicated to healing, I felt profound gratitude for the crisis that had brought me to this moment. My broken heart had led to a full life, my family's rejection had led to chosen family's acceptance, and my near-death experience had taught me how to truly live. The best revenge isn't destruction, it's transformation. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is love yourself enough to walk away from people who can't love you back. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.